relationship that Koreans have had with foreigners may have come through hagwons. So hagwons for a long time have actually served as kind of intercultural exchange centers to many Koreans. So with this lecture, perhaps Koreans may enjoy examining how kind of English language and English speakers have affected modern contemporary Korean culture, simply because of that exposure. At the same time, and partly because many of the speakers and the teachers, I should say, employed by hagwons had American English, in a sense you may wonder what the influence of the US has been on not only Korean modern contemporary history, but also Korean kind of understanding of English and of American culture, and therefore of Western culture. When you see and listen, I should say, K-pop, sometimes there are of course English verses. Perhaps in recent years there's been an increase in the number of songs that have simply used English, although thankfully most still use Korean only. But when you see English and hear English, how do you think Koreans have become familiar with English when they use it? And of course, I'm not just thinking of K-pop idols, some who have come from overseas, as I'm sure you're aware. The hagwon system in Korea started roughly, I believe, in the 1960s. And it was in a sense driven by the quality, the poor quality of education institutes in Korea at the time. So in the 60s and 70s, a lot of parents began to feel that sending their kids to school was not actually going to do them much good in terms of their development, because the schools were kind of poorly run. They weren't really teaching that much, even though there was an increasing pressure of students to do well for the entrance exams. So you had an increasing pressure to do well, and then you had schools and institutes of learning that didn't really prepare them for the entrance exams to universities. So to remedy that, so-called, and you can call this shadow education, as some people call it, these kind of private institutes came up that said, no, we can actually do this. We can train your children in kind of the key things that are going to be tested, which of course includes science, social science, math, and English. In the beginning, English wasn't even part of the testing system, but eventually it was added. And so then parents had to wonder how they could ensure that their children would do well in the exams. And so over the years, this led to a fast increase in a demand for hagwons. However, in 1980, Chun Doo-hwan actually banned these hagwons from existing because he said, you know, they were not in line with his policies. And that ban was eventually abolished again when in 2000 the government decided that the ban itself was illegal and not in line with the government's policies. So there was a kind of a hiatus of roughly 20 years. And since then, the number has grown again. And in 1995, the Korean Ministry of Education then came up with a new English language program. And the program kind of tried to really emphasize the importance of cultural exchange. And so they were targeting especially foreigners, of course, from English-speaking countries, and offered employment in Korea kind of as a wonderful travel opportunity, a unique opportunity for cultural exchange, both to the people who would take the lessons and those teaching them eventually. The only thing they needed was a clean record, a police check, in other words, and an undergraduate degree, as well as English, good English. One of the major problems that Hagwons have faced is that they couldn't always get good people, and it was partly because they didn't know. When someone came from America, or so the United States or Canada, or they came from Australia, but they were actually really bad teachers, or had a really odd way of speaking, and I'm not just thinking of dialects, then they didn't always know. And they sometimes might have known, but have had no way of remedying the situation because they needed teachers. And then it's better to have a native speaker in your classroom rather than have no one. So because they advertised having foreigners, many of the Hagwon ended up kind of lowering the standard of the education they offered as a result. So what role then did these foreign teachers play in improving Koreans' English? And what are the other factors that helped improve Koreans' cultural understanding and their ability to successfully engage with foreigners in English? And one of the things that I guess made it important for Hagwons to up their game, so to speak, is that from 1989 onward, Koreans were finally allowed to travel for leisure purposes again. And that meant that Koreans could now go overseas and try English, but also it put some pressure on Koreans to do so, and to be able to do so. Now, suddenly, not only were Koreans able to travel abroad, but more and more, especially after the '88 Olympics, more and more foreigners were now coming to Korea too. So the pressure, in a sense, was on. Koreans had to learn English. And just having a native speaker quite quickly was no longer enough, as even Koreans could tell the difference between someone who had nice English and very strong dialect. And I remember back in the 1990s, I had a colleague in the UK who had a very strong Mancunian accent, and he ended up working in Korea. And I met a Korean student of his, not knowing that he had been her student, and she had the same very strong Manchester accent. And I asked her, "Where did you learn English?" And she said, "Oh, from this man," which is interesting, because although it's perfect English, it's maybe confusing, and it may not be the easiest English to use when the expectation is of you as a Korean to speak kind of, let's say, plain English, British English or Australian English, or of course American English. One of the other problems was that because of pressure from parents, a lot of the Hagwons ended up hiring people who looked the part. So they were white, they were young, they were not African American. Initially, I think that played a role. Unfortunately, they weren't too old. again, so there was sexism, there was kind of racism, and there was ageism involved in the hiring practices of some, not all, some Hagwon. And of course the government did not approve this, and I guess over time the Korean parents have also asked for people with actual skill in teaching English, and they've gone away from demanding that someone looks the part, as they themselves also started to perhaps become more comfortable around the diversity of the world as they traveled. So apart from travel having quite a strong impact on the experience of Koreans learning English, there was also this impactful TV show called the Nun Summit. Again, this involved foreigners coming to Korea and then of course appearing in a studio and talking about the differences between Korea and their own culture, and sometimes between each other's cultures. It was a very popular show on television, and it showed that foreigners could learn Korean. So if they could learn Korean, of course, why can't Koreans learn English? It certainly showed that it was possible to engage with foreigners easily. These people are always very friendly and open-minded. It also showed that it's possible to learn a foreign language well, without much of a background. In addition to this, I guess Hagwons have also, as they are called, Hagwons, have also come to understand that students need energy to make the best of their learning. So in the past, you often had classes run in the very late hours of the day, sometimes even up to 2 a.m. in the morning. But there's very little that you'll pick up when you're learning English, for example, at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. And I remember myself working for the Chongno 외국어 학원, the Chongno Foreign Languages, I guess Hagwon could be translated as institute or cram school. Back in the 90s for a little while as a student, and my class started at 7 a.m., which meant that the people in my class were very sleepy and tired, and the effect I had on their learning was minimal. Unfortunately, I think, despite my best efforts and despite the fact that I actually had some training in teaching at tertiary level that I'd taken in London, the effectiveness of my teaching in the classroom, I think, was minimal because of that issue of timing. And I think Hagwons these days are better able to negotiate that with their customers and tell them that learning at, for example, 1 a.m. or 7 a.m. is not ideal, and that they need to set aside certain times for learning, a certain energy, in other words. I think that also has played a role, the timing of learning, the fact that people were traveling, of course, and the fact that you now have foreigners on TV speaking Korean. All those things, I think, will have played a role. Just in general, I think there is now a greater sense of duty, expectation, if you like, among Koreans to engage. In the past, it was rather scary to speak a foreign language in front of a foreigner, and I think Koreans have overcome that fear, and so they're much more comfortable engaging. And most people tell me, non-Koreans tell me, that when they travel to Korea, everybody speaks English. And I think that's not because of the institutes per se, it's because Koreans have become more comfortable even trying out their perhaps not so very good English, but they just feel more comfortable using it. One final thing that is perhaps worth noting is that for a while middle school children were asked to go to Insadong, which is this kind of cultural street in the center of Seoul, and ask in English a list of questions to foreigners. So they would come up to you if you looked foreign, and then they would ask you in English a set of questions. And it was kind of ironic because the questions were all very similar to the things they had been taught during the Park Chung-hee era about why Korea was so special and why they were so different from the West. And one of the things that the education during Park Chung-hee and Chun Do-won always emphasizes that Koreans can really appreciate their own spicy food. Foreigners can't eat kimchi. Korea is unique because it has 4 seasons. So there's a list of things. And when these children came up to you back in the 90s, those questions were there too. Do you like Korean food? Can you eat kimchi? Do you have 4 seasons? So that persisted, those questions did. Another problem with the questions was that they never asked something that you might find challenging, which is a real question. The other questions always sounded a little bit like, tell us why you like us. When maybe you were in Korea for work or for reasons other than tourism. So I think rather than improving the questions, maybe a lot of teachers have given up on this little assignment, which I can tell you most of these middle school children did not appreciate much at all. They looked very uncomfortable. Anyway, I think overall the Hagwon certainly have had a massive effect on the kind of the understanding that people had of foreign countries, because many of the people coming to work for the Hagwons did not intend to stay for very long. And so because they didn't consider coming here as true migrants, they were quite free about engaging with students outside the classroom, because many of them came alone. So if the students then engaged with them during and after class and said, hey, do you want to have a cup of coffee? I think many of them did. And that will have also impacted on that relationship, positive relationship. So ultimately, I think the teachers at Hagwons have been, I guess, involved in a kind of cultural diffusion of their own native country to Korea through their engagement. And of course, Koreans have also embedded some Koreanness in the teachers, or at least I hope so. The cultural exchanges kind of developed through the Hagwons, I think are worth considering. It will have been significant.